So this is actually a very internal workshop, right? It's by our faculty for our faculty. So even though there are slides and there is a bit of structure, let's keep it very open and interactive. Please feel free to interrupt at any time. And if I can just request Brinal, in case there's something on chat that I miss, just let me know in between, because toggling between the screen and chat sometimes is a bit hard. So
Yeah,
for all of you, do ask questions even in between. I've built in some pause points also in between where we can stop and reflect and just do some interaction. Okay, so this title is a little provocative, or rather it's either very routine. We can give a large number of answers based on where we come from. Today's talk or session, and as well as all the others by our colleagues, both from EP and from other, and mostly from the other departments, there is one let me call it differentiator or one key aspect, that these are all research-based strategies. And what I mean by that is there's decades of research on how people learn, both the cognitive aspect of it, the social aspect of it, as well as the subject aspect of it. So there are formal fields like discipline-based education research. So in CS, there's CS education research, engineering education research, physics education research, math, and everything. These come with their own formalisms. They're interdisciplinary, of course, but they also have their own conferences, their own journals. So a lot of what, actually almost all of what I'll be talking about today and all what my colleagues will be talking about come from this perspective. So it is both teaching and research, but it's research into learning and research into teaching. So why this is useful is, like Professor Sudarshan mentioned, it's like every course is different, every individual is different. But at the same time, when we have both a scientific basis for it and a lot of thoughtful engineering behind it. So teaching in a way is like engineering because you're applying the science of learning. So when there are a lot of studies, a lot of results which say what the context is and when it applies and all, it using it is actually quite meaningful and quite useful. So that's sort of the basis of today's talk. The second thing is, I thought I'd just introduce my department in a couple of minutes, because for those of you who are new, this is a rather new academic unit in the institute. It's not a full-fledged department, of course. It's an IDP, an interdisciplinary program. It's just over 10 years old. And we have 5 core faculty. I think 2 more who will be talking in these in this workshop. Not today, one today and one later. We also have a lot of participation from associate faculty from the engineering department, science department, IDC, HSS, so past and present. We have postdocs. Currently, I think it's 3, and several academic research staff on projects and mostly on projects. And we have PhD research scholars. Actually, this number is outdated as of yesterday. We had 8 more join yesterday, and 19 have graduated. So that we started with a PhD program 10 years ago, and we started an MTech program just 2 years ago when our first cohort began. So if you want to know more about our department, of course, there's the web page, but there's also that 5-minute YouTube movie that all departments made a couple of 3 years ago, I think, for the Diamond Jubilee. I think that will also give a good overview. I'll, of course, share my slides later with the PPCCLT. Okay, so what do we actually do in terms of research in our department? One of the flagship projects is what we call as technology enhanced learning of disciplinary practices. And what is a disciplinary practice essentially is, it starts with content, but it goes beyond content. So it's what experts do, what experts use on a day-to-day basis when they engage in their professions. For example, design thinking. Um, you design, okay, so you design bridges, we design systems. It could be estimation, troubleshooting, problem solving. So all these practices, in some ways, a lot of engineering and science disciplines have similar practices, but they manifest differently, they are operationalized differently. So what this research trust does is that we look at a particular concept or a particular topic, and we design, develop, and evaluate what we call as technology-enhanced learning environments. So what you see on the right side is called METAL. It was by one of our PhD students who graduated 2 years ago. This is to help students learn engineering estimation, power-based estimation of the type. So a student is given a question like, uh, can the human heart power a wine opener? And these are sort of early engineering students, second year maybe or third year, and they have that's all that's given, and they have to essentially model the system, model the heart, model the wine opener, what's the power output, what's the power required, see if the numerics work out and all. So for this, what the student did is she created a lot of features in the system to help students build models like concept maps, lots of simulators to help them numerically arrive at the equations. Again, this is not a very well-defined problem, and that's deliberate because that's a kind of problems that often we do in our disciplines. So we have about 10, I would say more like 12 or 15 such learning environments in various areas, various disciplines, physics, electrical engineering, a lot in computer science, genetics, software design, and so on. And we have several students and several faculty working on this. Two other recent research areas are the use of emerging technologies, wearables, augmented reality, virtual reality, and analytics. And you'll be hearing from Professor Ramkumar Rajendran later today, who works in learning analytics. Okay, coming closer to what we'll be discussing today, we have another area called teacher use of educational technology, or TUTE. So this area actually is an intersection of research, development, and outreach. It is research based, but it's heavier. The emphasis is a lot more on development and outreach here. So in terms of research, we have designed and tested models called, the main one is called learner-centric model. So if you want to design a MOOC, how do you ensure student engagement? How do you address diversity? How do we give them opportunities for practice and application in large scale, in a massive scale? And how do we give feedback? So this is the LCM model. And there are several courses, MOOCs, which have been and deployed based on the LCM model. And this has been, there's a lot of outreach efforts, faculty development programs, and all over the country. Other development and outreach, we've created several handbooks for research students, maybe PhD students who want to go on to teaching, lots of tools in classroom, usage tools for teachers. Again, it's there on our website. And I think the reason I just wanted to flash this is, especially those of you who've just begun your teaching careers and all, or, if you want to if you're curious to see what exists in the public domain, just go to this, there's certain things that we have created and tested, and we're sharing them. Okay, so let's come back to today's talk. And let me start with the title, okay? Because the title actually, in a way, Mrinal just asked, Dr. Mrinal Patwardhan, she asked me a couple of weeks ago, can you talk about this? And I said, okay, let's see what we can do. It's an interesting title. It can, what do we talk about it? So the way we both started discussing it and I approached it is, let's actually reflect on the title and what this really means. If we are asking, are my students learning what they should be? It really means, is my course design working? So we are going from students learning through teaching to the entire course design. And design means, the curriculum, the learning activities, the way we interact, the instructional strategies, the assessment, all of it together, and everything in between. So what I would like to do in the rest of the talk is to have this lens of course design when we talk of our students learning, what they should be learning, how do we know, and so on. So let's actually parse this a little further. And this question actually is a bunch of more specific questions. So are students learning what they should be learning translates to, the first question is, what should they really be learning and how can we define it? Are they really learning it and how do we know? These are the two main questions inherent in the title, but there are also two implied questions. What can we do to help them learn better, them being the learners, the students? And if we do something to help them learn better, are they then learning it, after we do that? So if we map this to terminology, essentially what we are talking about is course outcomes. So what students should be learning? is, the technical term here is course learning outcomes, sometimes people call it learning objectives, but that's kind of a little, currently it's more, the learning outcomes language is a little bit more common. We'll come in a moment what exactly it is. Are they learning it is clearly assessment of various types. So we'll spend some time on it. And what can we do to help students learn better based on our understanding of the first two questions? Are a whole category of research-based strategies, such as active learning. Active learning is also a whole category. We'll touch upon it today, but next Saturday we'll do a deep dive into active learning and other research-based strategies. Okay, so what exactly are course learning outcomes? To define it, it's a statement of intent, and it should address the question, what should my students be able to do as a consequence of the instruction? It is the intent of the design of our course. So instead of talking a lot more about this, let's just do a few examples. So if you don't mind, since this is called a workshop, there have to be activities. So whenever you see this orange or pink slide, there'll be something that I'll ask you to do, either write or talk or post on chat or poll or something. So let's go back to this question. Can you just write one learning outcome for your course? This is not, yeah. Just imagine a course that you taught last semester, or preferably something that you will be teaching this coming semester. Write one learning outcome. You don't need to post anything on chat. Just write it on a piece of paper or in your device, whichever you're using. There's a part 2 of this, so I'll just give you all a minute. If you're approximately done, can you just post in chat that you're done? I want to get a feel for how many are done. We have about 30, little less than 30 participants, I think. So if you're, just wait till a few more people are done.
Hi, Sahana. If I may clarify, can you clarify on what is the learning outcome? Like, what does that mean?
So learning outcome right now, it's okay even if it's vague. It's basically what should my students be able to do after my course.
All right. It can be any specific topic. Is that okay?
It can be a topic. Yeah, it can be at any granularity. At this point, we'll not worry about it too much.
Okay, thanks.
But we'll come back to this granularity question. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so if you have done that, then what I would like all of us to do is just examine it. And there was a poll I wanted to set up. I wasn't able to do it in WebEx. So there is an external an external app. It's actually a useful thing for us as instructors to know about it in case you haven't. It's called Mentimeter. So if you can just go to this web link, you can use the QR code or you can use the link. I will also do one thing. I'll post this link on the chat so that, you can just use anything. It's basically a yes, no question to this poll, but I do want to take a look at the distribution of yeses and nos. So let me try to post it on chat. Yeah, here goes. So what I can see is slightly different than what you can see. And I'll just show you in a minute my interface also. So far about 5 people have responded. Just wait for a little bit more.
Sahana, I'm sorry. Can you please clarify the question that you have asked?
The
Like, what
question
do you
is,
mean by outcome with understand/no?
okay. The question is, did you start your course learning outcome with understand? So did you say something like students should understand Faraday's law, or students should understand convolution? Is the word understanding there in your outcome? Or students should know the topic of
So
XYZ?
you mean the answer that I've given to the previous point, does that have the word understand or no? Is that
Exactly,
what?
exactly,
Okay, okay, got it.
exactly. Yeah.
Thanks.
This is anonymous, by the way, okay? Even if I tried, I wouldn't know who's saying what. Okay, so let me do one thing. Actually, it's okay. I can just tell you the. No, let me actually show you. Let me stop this and share something else for a minute. So what I saw actually is, what I see is a result like this. So this is the teacher interface. So we have 18 people who have 18 people who have responded, and 2/3 have said that the word understanding or no is present in the course learning outcome. So the reason I wanted to get to this is because there's a bit of a problem when we use this word understanding. And the reason is the following. Okay, I should be back to my slides, okay? If in case you can't see it, just let me know. So suppose I'm teaching a basic course on analog electronics. So I'm going to keep this topic because A, I'm somewhat familiar with it, and I think, and it's more like at the first year or even high school level. So I just, it's very hard to find a topic which all of us are familiar with. But if we do it without an exemplar topic, then it gets very abstract. So I'll keep this. It's okay if, you don't get the details, but I'll use this running example. So suppose my learning outcome is that students should understand Kirchhoff's laws, okay? Or whatever, insert your favorite topic uh, or the topic that you have used. So what exactly does understand Kirchhoff's laws mean? Does it mean that I want students to be able to state KCL, KVL in its verbal form, algebraic form and all? Of course, as a teacher, I do want them, and we don't ask questions like that in IIT, but I do want them to be able to state the laws. Do I want them to relate the algebraic equation to the more physical conservation of charge? Or does understanding Kirchhoff's laws mean that I want students to draw the input-output characteristics for a given circuit? Does it mean that I give them, some complicated circuits, maybe 3 or more loops, and ask them to solve for current and voltage? Does it mean I want them to design a circuit for a given real life situation? Like maybe there's a staircase, the classic staircase, and we need to operate the switch either from the bottom or from the top. So all these are valid ways of interpreting the word understand Kirchhoff's laws. And if we just stare at this list, we'll see that they're actually quite different. Of course, they're related to each other. But which of these do we really want our students to be able to do? We can say all of it, not an issue. But we have to be very deliberate if we mean all of it. Maybe in a high school course, we will stop at the third bullet, and we may want them to solve for current and voltage only with, 2 loops or some simple circuits as they call them. So if we want to really, let's ask ourselves, how will we differentiate students between, those who understood and those who did not? So we start thinking in terms of questions we can ask them, in terms of the assessment we can ask them. But if we say that my course learning outcome is that students should understand Kirchhoff's laws, we are in a bit of trouble because it's not well defined. The word understand is not well defined. It encompasses too many things. And if we try to differentiate one group of students from another, we sort of start getting into a mess. So the takeaway here is when we write our learning outcomes for our course or for a topic, we need to be very specific. We need to be concrete. We need to write those learning outcomes in a more measurable fashion so that we can differentiate the students. So whether you use the word understand or no, now what I'll ask you is to just revisit your learning outcome, revise if necessary. Start it with students should be able to. That will give a very nice handle. And use what's called a performance indicator. That's very specific, concrete, measurable. Here are some examples. You can say students should be able to solve, students should be able to predict currents, in this case, students should be able to analyze a 3-loop circuit, whatever it may be. And if you don't mind, just share some of your outcomes on the chat. Maybe the word understand is not ambiguous in your case, but think whether it's ambiguous or very specific and concrete from the student's perspective. And if it's not clear what I'm asking, please interrupt. There are about 4 or 5 responses. I will comment on it in a moment. Actually, all of these are bang on target. And I'm not sure if you had these to begin with or you revised it after that little discussion on the ambiguity with the word understand or no. But we'll come to that in a minute. Okay. Excellent. Let's just look at these a little bit. So firstly, almost all of these have a performance indicator. Sometimes it's also called an action verb to begin, which means that we know exactly what we expect from students. And the major recommendation here is that we also share these with students. So students also know what they'll be expected to do in the course or at what level is the course pitched. So if you just look at the examples we see in the chat or even the examples on the previous page, you will see that there is some sort of a hierarchy. Some of it are maybe more, at a, I'm going to use the word higher level, more intense level, it requires more thinking, more cognitive processing, and some are more of a remembering or a simple application. So that is one point. The second point is, let's look at the one which says that, I'll pick the one. Yeah, I'll pick the last one. It says students should be able to explain the significance of Maxwell's contribution in understanding electromagnetic wave theory. Now, this is actually pretty well phrased. What I would have done initially, if I did not know that it needs to be precise, I would have written something like students should be able that students should appreciate Maxwell's contribution. As experts and faculty members and teachers, we really want students to appreciate our subject because we like it so much. The problem is we can't define or we won't know how students actually do appreciate it. It's hard to observe appreciation. It's almost impossible to measure students' appreciation. We get a fuzzy feeling when a student comes and says, I'm excited, and look, this is what Maxwell had done, and this is why his contribution is so important. But to capture that, the way this outcome is phrased, actually it captures it rather well, that students should be able to explain the significance, which means we can also give them a question, a viva question if you want, or we can ask them, what was his contribution and why is it significant? Okay, so going from these sort of very intuitive, natural ways of thinking of course outcomes to a more precise one is what the learning outcomes or course outcomes framework suggests. The other reason why it's recommended so much is that just think of the design process. We're all designing our courses. We can't design something unless its intent is very clear. If somebody says, go design a bridge, we'll ask questions like, where is it located? Is it over a river or is it over a railway track? How long should it be? What's the kind of vehicles that will traverse it? What's the volume, or how long do you want it to last? Is it in a place where it rains a lot? So we'll probe this question of intent, the purpose of the design in great detail. That is the analogy here. All right. Just one or two more things before I come to a pause point. So now, to make our life easier, there are many frameworks available, and the most popular one goes by the name of Bloom's taxonomy. I'm not going to get into details, but I can share all the materials here. This defines outcomes in a hierarchy. It's called a hierarchy of cognitive levels from the bottom to the top. The bottom is where we remember things, and all the way up top is where we design and create. Somewhere in the middle is where we apply and solve. So it not only gives us this hierarchy, it also gives us a list, suggests to us a list of these action verbs or performance indicators that loosely, that fairly well map to these levels. There may be some overlaps, that's why I use the word loosely, but it maps to these levels. So such frameworks, there are many such frameworks available. This is the most popular one. And when we are designing a new course, or if we get one of those syllabi from ASC, which are very cryptic, it has those bullets that one bullet would be KCL and KVL. It is our job as an instructor to interpret it and to actually articulate what are the course outcomes and at what levels we expect students to perform. Okay, so I do want to pause here and just hear from you comments, comments, even concerns. Is there any value you perceive to defining these? Where do you see yourself using it? Where do you see the value for students, or what concerns you might have? Because after this, I want to move to a slightly different point. So you can unmute and speak or post in chat, any of that. So like in any classroom, we are afraid of deathly silence. But my postdoc mentor taught me one thing. She said that wait for 10 seconds, or maybe it was 8 seconds. 8 seconds is an eternity when there is silence. So I'm just going to wait for a full 15 seconds in case any of you want to share.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
This is I have never taught before. I just joined as professor of practice in the Desai Sethi School of Entrepreneurship.
Sure. Hi.
And I
Can I ask
have
who's
read about
speaking? I'm
Anuradha Narasimhan.
Yeah, hi Anuradha.
Anuradha Narasimhan. I can start video if you.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So the question is, outcomes will range from some starting with understanding, gaining an overview, to a ultimate one, which is, like the one you called out just now, which is the ability for the student to explain it back to us, or the one I had said, which is the ability of the student to present and prepare. So I'm sure learning outcomes for a course will be not one, but maybe 3, 4, 5, and they will span the spectrum of the Bloom's taxonomy that you just shared.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So this is absolutely right. So now let me elaborate a little bit further. So when we say it's not a single outcome, it can be a range of outcomes. Typically for a course, if we are talking at the level of a course, which is, for 3 months, 40 classes, 14 weeks, whatever it is, or maybe even a half semester course, or maybe a 3-week workshop, it doesn't matter how long the course is. But at that level, there'll be, we have to consider all the topics in their entirety and also how they fit together because as an instructor, we have the big picture. So the course outcomes, this is again a rule of thumb or a very gentle recommendation. It's of the order of exactly like you said, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's at the course level, it's usually not more than 10. I mean, 10 is huge, a huge number for a set of course outcomes. The reason is, once we have a course outcome, now when we start breaking it down and look at the topics that we have to teach, that has a lot of sub outcomes, and those are called outcomes at the module level, unit level. So there's a whole top down way of writing and doing course design. And it's at, so it's called course level. Actually, it starts even higher. It starts at the department level. They're called department program educational outcomes. So at a department, it's recommended that the whole department sit and discuss for weeks together, come up with a set of outcomes for the graduates. And then each course has its course outcomes, which is aligned to the top, which are derived from the top, and then the course outcomes go into topic outcomes. So if you look at the small granular topic level, you might have 30, 40, 50 in your course.
Got it.
But
Thank
at the course level, it's 3 or 4. Yeah, thanks for bringing this up.
Thank you.
Professor Jaya Balila has written that it clarifies that students and the instructor are on the same page when it comes to expectations from the course. Absolutely. So this sort of a mismatch or misalignment is very common. It's a lot more common I've seen in the university system, where I think it's true even in IIT, but here there is an expectation that, a lot of our outcomes will at least be at the simple apply level. Usually we don't give questions like define something or state something, even though in the quiz we might. But you're absolutely right that it clarifies that understand KCL does not mean simply, repeat the statement of it. Can I request, if you're speaking, that's great. Otherwise, can I just request you to keep your mics muted, because I'm hearing an echo and sometimes there is something else. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on. So the main takeaway here is that well-defined course outcomes lead to a well-defined intent for the design, and they need to be clearly articulated. We saw the various reasons. There are a couple of other clear reasons, and that's what I want to spend the next half an hour on. Okay, so let's go back to our key questions from the beginning of the session. That, what should students be learning? These are the course outcomes or learning outcomes. We discussed that. The next question is, are they learning it, and how do we know? And this really is in the forte of assessment. So a very brief digression, and I'm not going to ask you this question because I think all of us know this. If we ask ourselves, what's the purpose of assessment? There are many things we will say. We will start with something like to find out or to identify or diagnose what the student knows, where they're at, to determine what to do based on where they're at. Diagnosis usually is the first step. But once we know where the student is at, what level they're at, it can inform us in many ways. Sometimes we use it to pull out the first ranker or the gold medalist. We make decisions of that type. Sometimes we may just use that information to decide. So let's say we give a quiz and we see the diagnose where students are at, and we figure out that, oops, students really are struggling with this subtopic. They're okay up to the definition of it, but they're not okay applying it. And we might do a revision of our course, of our instruction in the next class. We definitely use this information to rank students, and our JEE and GATE and all is the classic indicator. So assessment has various purposes. Again, there's a whole framework here on the purpose. But if we abstract all of it out, we use assessment, or assessment is used, the purpose is to diagnose, decide, and take some action, right? So now let's spend time on this decision part. So there is a classic statement that keeps getting repeated, put out, that it's not just us, it's the students also who need to know where they're going in order to get there. And for assessment to be meaningful, it has to be derived from the course outcome. So there's a graphic, and then I'll go back to the question. So where is the student now? This is the questions we ask. This is the assessment. These are the quizzes or any of the assessment. But what really, where is this coming from? we actually should be asking the question at the beginning, where does the student really need to go? And the circle on the left-hand side is our course outcome that we've already defined. That's why that was there at the beginning. Normally, when we think of assessment, we always, we start by looking at what the student is doing. But when we start framing the assessment questions, writing our question papers, we actually do have this question in mind, the one on the left-hand side on where does the student need to go. So it's actually the course outcomes which guide and almost define the assessment. Okay, how do we find out is the assessment process. So coming to the concrete example, if we pick any question here, if we pick any of the outcomes here, you can pick the outcome that you have stated also, and just think for a moment of asking a question that we could pose to students, asking a question we could ask them to determine if the students have achieved the outcome. Just do this thought exercise in a moment. If you want to say something, go ahead, but it's more of a thought exercise. You can either do it for any of the outcomes on the slide here or on your own outcomes. So let me pick a couple from the chat. Let's actually look at what Anuradha had written earlier, since she talked about it. Students should be able to prepare and present a startup business plan by the end of the course. Absolutely. So if we want to assess that they did this, we actually need them to create a portfolio or create a business plan. We need them to be able to present it in class. So there has to be some sort of presentation, some viva involved. This is not a 3-hour written test. So the outcome is actually dictating not the format and the content of the assessment. Anurag, do you want to add to this? I know I just jumped in. I don't know your subject, but how would you assess this outcome?
No, so this is I'm doing a live course. So we have 2 presentations, one at the mid semester and one at the end semester. The only difference is it's presented by a team of students, not by a single student. And they work on a business idea, on something they would like to start up. It is live in that sense. So 50% or 40%, if I'm not mistaken, is on the presentations. The mid-sem and the end-sem are, of course, individual, but they ask similarly for students. They're given a case and they're asked to design a business plan given the data that they have. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is broken down into maybe sub-outcomes. Some are considered in the mid-sem and some later. And some in the presentation. It also dictates the fact whether it's collaborative or individual. So you see, there is an alignment that we are coming to. Let me pick one more from Professor Parinda Vasa. Actually, I wanted to comment on this earlier. So Parinda has written that they should be able to apply the principles taught in class to a somewhat different situation. This is actually a very valuable point, because whatever the principle is, it could be Kirchhoff's laws, it could be electromagnetics, any principle you can name there. But our outcome should make it very clear to students that they will be assessed on a novel situation or on a situation not discussed in class. And we should frame questions accordingly. So it's helpful to get to, you might think that, look, this is really nitty-gritties and why are we nitpicking so much? The reason is, the same reasons that we have talked, but if we have these clear at some point, preferably at the beginning, but even if it evolves as the course progresses, it will give us a clear handle on how to frame, how to create the assessment questions. I'm saying this now in a slightly abstract manner. Right after this, Professor Swaroop Ganguly will share his experiences in a course where he did a lot of this. And our people from our IDP were involved, a couple of graduate students and me. And we did, in the midterm, we actually revised the assessment plan, because there was a little bit of lack of alignment, even though the intent was very strong, but we noticed that the alignment was not very strong. So we actually redid this, and he'll share the experience there. So coming back to the ones on the slide, just to give you very quick examples, if I want them to draw input-output, if the outcome is that they should be able to represent the input-output characteristics for a given circuit, I'll give them a question, I'll give them a diagrammatic question. Give them one circuit and ask them to draw something. So Okay. Let's just get to takeaway. I think we've made the point clear. If you want, you can ask a little bit more. Assessment should be aligned to outcomes, and assessment should be at different cognitive levels based on the outcomes. So this is the other takeaway. It might seem that this is obvious, and I hope it is, as we grow more experience, we feel that this is very obvious. But all of these are, it's more like a checklist for us as we design the course, and especially for novice teachers. So I started teaching in my second year of graduate school, PhD. I was in a state university, and for TA, we had to do all that. And those who were interested were given our own course to teach. There was no faculty. So somewhere in my fourth year or so, I was teaching my own course of 40, and I was very excited. I created a mid-sem exam of some 15 questions. All were at the higher end of the spectrum. And a lot of students failed that mid-sem, and then I got a earful from my head of the department. Look, you don't know how to create assessment questions. And the mistake I was making is I really wanted to push them high. So I thought all the assessment questions have to be at that level. So it's not just that we give them rote learning questions. Sometimes we could make a mistake at the other end also. Okay. The last point for today is the third, we had a third question. What can we do to help them get there? And get there could be learn better if we want to speak more intuitively, or get there could be achieve the learning outcomes, since we have defined it very precisely for now. So one answer, there's many answers here. And like Professor Sudarshan mentioned, when you get more experience, you have a lot of tools in your teaching toolkit. And like I mentioned at the beginning, research also gives us a large number of strategies. So one answer which has a lot of results to back it up is goes under the category of formative assessment. And the idea of formative assessment is that we provide multiple and frequent opportunities for students to apply their knowledge. Low stakes activities, maybe in every class. Low stakes means it's okay to keep a grade, but a very small grade, a whiff of grade, as sometimes people say. No grade is also okay, but we have to ensure that students somehow do it. Frequent and multiple is important. Immediate application is important. That's one part of formative assessment. So we design these activities throughout and sprinkle them. The second important point of formative assessment is the feedback that we provide to the learner. This feedback has to be as soon as possible. It has to be given as soon as possible. And it should be constructive. That means it has to help the learner improve specifically. A mid-sem exam, unfortunately, mid-sem exam can also be formative, because we do sometimes write comments, we give them feedback, but it's not sufficient. It's not bad, but it's not sufficient, because sometimes it happens a week later. It's necessary. I'm not saying a mid-sem is not necessary, but it doesn't do a terrific job of formative assessment alone. There is another type of assessment. I didn't throw these names earlier. It's called summative assessment, where we also want to get an idea of, the summative is this combined, the synthesis piece. We want to get an idea of where students stand and rank them and all. So mid-sem exam does the job of both. But formative assessment is a lot more than that. This also goes by the terminology of closing the formative feedback loop or closing the formative assessment loop. So this thing at the top are the assessment activities, the formative activities that we just talked about. The thing at the bottom helps the student know go from where they are now to where they should be going. And this is the feedback part, how to get there. So what is in between are formative assessment activities. You can just call them class activities or course activities, and corresponding, along with the feedback. I've just put two research papers here. The one from 2010, this was a seminal paper. It has been cited, I don't know, a few thousand times, because Black and William, who are actually assessment theorists, they make a point there. They have done a meta-analysis of lots of studies, and lots as in several hundred studies. They've done some regression analysis, and they found that the strategy that, in their own words, provides the most bang for the buck is formative assessment. And they show they show a lot of details there. And there's a more recent, actually, no, the second one is not more recent. Sorry, I thought that was more recent. So what exactly, or what are some examples of this formative assessment? And, how do we design it? One example is what we just saw when I asked you to write down learning outcomes, revise it, and gave you feedback. Okay, something as quick as that, it's very natural. We do this in a class. But the moment we think of it as an activity designed to help the learners, in this case, the participants, all of you, apply the definition of learning outcome and explain the significance of it, then it just makes it a little bit sharper and a little bit more precise. So here is an example from that circuits course. This is done in a class either online or face-to-face. It used to be face-to-face. It can be done online also. This is a voting or a polling question. Okay. But if you see, there are no numerics, there are no numbers. And if you see, there's actually some amount of reasoning to be done. I'll tell you the history of this question. So here the question is, circuit is provided. So excuse the sloppiness of my diagram. Okay, it's just a standard circuit. Sometimes these lines don't join well and all. So there are 3 bulbs, A, B, C. You can assume they're identical. There's a switch here which is open. This is sort of like a high school level problem. And then the switch is closed. That's the after. And the student is asked, this is closed, no? By the way, sorry for the space here. The student is asked what happens to the brightness of this guy, this bulb here, after the switch is closed. Now, this question actually is used in physics education research a lot, because one of the pioneering researchers from Harvard, Eric Mazur, what he said is that students were able to solve these really complicated mesh and loop circuits using KCL and KVL and a combination of those. But when this question was presented, they didn't do well at all. I don't remember the numbers, but it was a large fraction, like 70+% of the class, this was Harvard students, undergraduate students, got wrong on this answer. Intuitively, all of them answered that, oh, there is a new bulb in the circuit now. Earlier, there was only A and C. Now I have a new, there's a third bulb. So the number of bulbs has increased. So, the brightness has gone down because something is being shared by 3 bulbs. This is not the scientific reasoning, but this is a very intuitive reasoning. It's not wrong, it sounds very logical that I introduce somebody new to share the same resources. That's where the students are coming from. So whatever is available has to go down because it's distributed equally. Now, the scientific answer, of course, you have to look at the parallel series, you have to look at the currents and so on. I won't get into the equations. You don't even need equations, you just need some reasoning. This is, even simple reasoning of Ohm's law is enough. The scientifically correct answer is actually A here, which is counterintuitive. So if you ask this question in class, do a poll. Let students vote individually first. Show them, you don't even have to show them the poll results. You can look at the poll results. And then if it's a face-to-face class, ask them to debate with each other. Just turn around, talk to your classmate. There's always somebody who has said that the brightness increases or the brightness stays the same. Pair students who have different answers, ask them to speak. If you're doing an online class, make maybe 5 breakout rooms and just distribute them even randomly is okay, because questions like this usually elicit a range of responses. And the task for the students is all of you must reach consensus. So they keep debating until there's a consensus, and then you can do a revote, or you can do a debrief where you show a video of it or an actual experiment. So this whole strategy is called peer instruction, and next week I think Sridhar will talk more about it. It can be done by voting, low tech way, 1, 2, 3. It can be done by flashcards, it can be done by clickers, and more recently there are Mentimeter, the voting app that you used earlier, that can be used for it. This technique also has a lot of research results backing it. So this is one useful thing. The key idea there is not to have terribly straightforward questions and preferably not numerical questions, because there could be a single correct answer, but something that enforces reasoning, that emphasizes reasoning. Come back to that. So there is a lot of evidence. This is more recent, it's less than 10 years old, where it says that if you do activities like this in class, this was a meta study again, and it analyzed more than 200 studies. It said that exam performance was higher by half a standard deviation in courses which employed techniques like this. Not only that technique, there's a whole range of techniques that go with active learning. Now, half a standard deviation in a study with, which is a meta study of 200 courses, is actually huge. And the authors say that, look, if this was a clinical trial for medicine, we would stop the study because of the positive benefit. Okay, so this is actually a very important result for a very, let's say, also a comforting result for instructors, that if I use some of these research-based strategies and do it right, something will improve. What is that something? In the courses that they analyzed, this was US-based, by the way, but the US universities, a lot of them, it's similar to IIT. It's not similar to Mumbai University and the university system. So failure rates got lowered. These were across the STEM disciplines, I think. Science, technology, engineering, math, etc. But it held across majors and non-majors, across the first and second years and the higher division courses. So those were some interesting points. They also go on to say what kind of questions in the exam elicited higher improvements. I haven't put that here. Okay. Any questions so far about this? Okay, we can take questions at the end also. There are many such tools, absolutely, including exit survey to evaluate each outcome, absolutely. So this peer instruction is just one method that I've suggested. Yeah, I think I heard somebody's mic go on. Right. Let's go back to this point of learning outcomes, okay? Because that's where we started from. So again, let's look at the alignment. The outcome so I'm kind of going backwards now. This is the assessment question where students had to analyze what happens, had to answer what happens to the brightness of this bulb A. The outcome it's actually addressing is that students should be able to analyze power, current, and voltage in Ohm's law. And I should also write in, circuits of this kind, however we want to characterize such circuits. So this is sort of putting it all together. Here is another example which addresses the outcome of relating representations, the one we saw with KVL and KCL. The feedback that you could give that will help them improve is, again, you could ask students after they vote to write down the characteristics for each of these, or pick the one that had the maximum inaccurate reasoning behind it, discuss that, but doing it immediately is the key here. The last point about assessment alone is, okay, fine, we talked about multiple choice questions, but what about, problems? What about design? What if I'm in a more social science field and I want to have some, I want them to write arguments, I want them to write essays, or I want them to create a business plan. How do we assess those? And again, this connects a bit to outcomes. I'll come to that in a minute. Their one recommendation is to use what are called rubrics. Rubrics are, it's more than a checklist. You can start thinking of it as a checklist, but it's more than that. It's a table, it's a table like this, where you as an instructor think of your outcome or of your question in terms of different criteria that you want to assess. So this is a design question, construct a voltage divider circuit or obtain some voltage from some other thing. It could be the business plan question that we heard earlier. But what are the aspects or elements to it? I'm not talking of steps, but aspects. So in this question on the screen, it could be they need to be able to represent the correct circuit diagrams. They need to be able to write down the KCL, KVL equations. They need to be able to solve the differential equation. So there are some criteria or sub outcomes, which you can put here, criterion 1, criterion 2, criterion 3, and then define what it means to have the target performance level, what it means to have a kind of okay, acceptable performance level, and what it means to have a poor performance level. So this table has to be filled out by an instructor. Creating this table does take time, and it's not that you have to do it for every single question, but you can do it for a class of problems. Like design circuit problems, you create a rubric, or presentations. For MTPs and BTPs, we actually create things, but usually we are at the level of checklist. Here it says define at different target levels based on the criteria, which again map to learning outcomes. These again can be, they're known to be very robust. They have very strong internet reliability when one instructor or the other one uses it, provided these cells are filled out precisely. They're also recommended for self-assessment by students. So we give these to students early on before they even do their project, saying this is what you'll be evaluated on. Okay. So putting it all together, these course learning outcomes, they guide assessment, they guide instruction strategies like the peer instruction class question that we saw. They ensure alignment. They inform course design and course redesign. How redesign is, I think Swaroop will talk a little bit more about that, but it can inform formative, quick corrective course actions in between. For example, if I know that students are doing terribly on this question, even though they can solve 3 mesh equations, I will maybe do something, maybe give them more practice on this, maybe go back and do a few one class or so on the reasoning, maybe in the advanced topic, but I might focus more of my energies on the reasoning. I might have them do a lot of collaborative activities where they articulate their reasoning. So there are a lot of different types of corrective actions that can be done in between a course, or it can inform the course design for the next offering also. Okay, so I know it's early, but I thought this would be a good time to stop and take any sort of questions, comments, and have some discussion and interaction. If this was too obvious at a very low level, ask me, fire me 5 questions. We'll see if we can get it more customized to what you're looking for.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanushri Chaudhary, and I just joined as an assistant professor. These comments, all the information that you were giving was very useful, but it made me think, as a first-time teacher, how do I assess if my learning outcomes itself are too ambitious? I'm not entirely sure if, so the assessment, the alignment, all of it comes from that. So how do I know how do I at least think for myself whether I'm starting out with something which is being too grand, and then that's going to lead to obviously problems later on?
Yeah. So clarification, Tanushri, is this a new course you're designing, or is that an existing course in the department, just hypothetically?
This is an existing course which hasn't been given out for a while, and it's an elective, so I have some independence in designing the course in a different way. Okay. And I would like to take it because I have seen the syllabus and I have my own opinion about it. So I'm trying to figure out how best to structure it.
Okay. And in that process, so this is a great question. How do I make sure my learning outcomes themselves are at quote unquote the correct or suitable level? Actually, let me throw it out to the audience. The reason is we have some very senior professors here, people who've been in departments, led curriculum committees and all for several years. So if anybody else wants to, please help me. Also people from the core engineering or science departments. The situation is there's a new faculty who's trying to, who's picked up a course that exists, but maybe hasn't been taught in a while. And how do we ensure that the outcomes themselves are appropriate. Any thoughts from, I mean, what would you do if one of your junior colleagues asked you this?
Yeah, so this is Sachin Patwardhan here. So in the change context, I would first try and write what should the student learn, and then go back and see whether the syllabus needs to be changed. So actually, what competencies the students need to acquire at the end of the course should be written first, particularly at the PG level, and then take a relook at the syllabus, whether it needs to be changed, augmented, modified.
So Sachin, one takeaway for me from your response was that the syllabus is the first thing that can guide this situation, this question, because there exists a syllabus, and let's start from it and see if the learning outcomes that we derive from the syllabus are meaningful and if we feel happy about it. And if not, we can relook at the syllabus itself. Swaroop has posted something in chat. Discuss with colleagues who have prior experience teaching the course. Yeah. Especially, there's one more point I would like to add here, that is, know the students, know the audience. Especially if you move to a different university or institute, there's some, a qualitative difference in the students themselves. So once we know typically what students in that program, what they bring, how they reason and all, that's also an important ingredient in writing the outcomes. Professor Neela, you wanted to share something? Hi.
Yeah, hi. So thanks for this interesting lecture. See, I think we need to, there are two aspects here. One is the syllabus itself will need some changes, and one has to evolve it according to the online situation. For example, just to give this example of numerical methods for partial differential equations. Okay, this is a standard course which many engineers also teach and so on. So for instance, it needs some support with, say, MATLAB or C++ or some kind of a numerical software, this thing. So if one teaches that course in an online semester, it becomes challenging. So one could think of how do you even tweak the syllabus to make them understand whatever they are expected to learn. The regular assignments may not be really possible. So one, because many of them are available in the internet and so on. So I would say you need to tweak the syllabus and the approach itself to make sure, okay, if there is an assignment component, make sure that rather than putting it as a bonus thing or something like that, because some of the students do not have the support, MATLAB support or C support with their devices and so on. So I believe there is to be a lot of tweaking even within the syllabus which may have to be done.
Yeah, thanks, Neela. So again, in addition to knowing your learners, know the context also. So the learner, the audience in some ways informs it, but the context very much, especially in these times, will inform backward the appropriateness of the outcomes. And if they need to be changed, sure. Jaya has a comment here. Jaya, do you want to just speak what you do?
Yeah, so
Sure.
when I
Yeah, go
started
ahead.
out, I think I did this, whether to call it a mistake or not, but yeah, like Tanushree mentioned, grand outcomes that we think that students should learn. And then the students felt that it was very heavy. So I was then later on always doing a prerequisite sort of a quiz in the beginning, right in the beginning of the semester, to know where they are. And from there actually tweak some of the learning outcomes. Of course, during the teaching process itself, we can take them to a certain level in order to sort of compare with what we expect from them. But I think it's very important to know where they are. And in a mixed class in electives, it's all the more the case that we think that they know certain things, but especially we have found in materials engineering, for example, that people come from physics, from chemistry, from even bio, nanotechnology. So all of these put together, their basic foundations are all very different. So and evaluating that and assessing based on that, changing the outcomes would be useful, is what I.
Yeah, thanks, Jaya. Professor Parag Bhargava has written, allow students to comment on the learning outcomes and if it matches their expectations from the course. So Parag, I'm curious, have you actually tried this and tweaked your outcomes accordingly? Because sometimes, we are apprehensive of throwing out such an important question to students, but I do see the value in it. So I'm curious to hear.
I have not made learning outcomes, but I have asked them what they want, what they expect out of the course, the learning outcomes. So I didn't do exactly in the same manner. Yeah.
Yeah, but if there's a mismatch, it's at least it's thought for us to revise.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Any other comments, questions? There's one more thing I wanted to mention. I just put back that last slide. Okay, this thing.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah, this
go
is
ahead, please.
Neeta
Yeah.
here. So
Hi, Neeta.
yeah, so I'll just add to what Professor Parag said. What I do is at the beginning of the class, I sort of take I mean, obviously if it's elective and it's a sizable class to do this, I do a round of introductions with the students, asking them to introduce their background, because as Jaya was saying, often they come from different backgrounds in an elective. And after that, I ask them why they have taken this course. They have obviously read what is on the website and chosen it, and or spoken to their seniors, etc. I ask them why are they taking this course and what do they expect to learn from this course. And then I show them the learning outcomes, and then I tell them very clearly at least the things that will not be covered in the course. So that part is very clear to them, what this course is not about and then what it is about. So that sort of I do in a verbal discussion with slides, but mainly by talking. Yeah, that's that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Neeta. Actually, let me ask Dr. Mrinal Patwardhan, because when we were discussing over the last week, she had some very interesting inputs to share regarding course design as well as redesign. And she's run a number of workshops for TAs and others in the institute and many outside also. So Mrinal, do you want to come in and, just talk a bit about how this helps course design or redesign, and especially the redesign examples?
Yeah, so one point that I would like to put here across is, for example, it so happens, especially where you have academic autonomy, that one time you take course in a particular manner, and next time when you are offering the same course, although the content remain the same, you try to take it in a different way. So it may be very curious question to ask ourselves as an instructor, or just to answer this question, that what happens to our learning outcome or course outcome in that case? I mean, is it, if my course content is going to remain the same, but I'm going to take it completely in a different manner, what kind of impact it may have on the course outcomes those were defined? So to what extent this the process of defining course outcomes should be dependent on the manner in which content delivery takes place throughout the semester? So maybe if somebody can have some views on this, perhaps I think that will be useful for others also who plan to offer courses in a different manner every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just share one thing here, is that I think Swaroop has written about look at the previous year's question papers to see faculty expectations. I think when students used to ask for previous year question paper, they were actually asking for what are the learning outcomes indirectly, or they judge the learning outcome looking at your previous question papers. So now, after attending workshops with Professor Freud, what I started doing is upfront in the first lecture itself, I share with them what are the learning outcomes. And once in the middle and once at the end, I revisit them. And I try to map that what we have done so far, does it map to the learning outcomes? So I try to stress that, look, I may not have covered the syllabus, it doesn't matter. As long as you have gained certain competency, that's more important. You'll be able to learn more things in the syllabus if something is missed during the course. But I think that helps. I mean, sharing the learning outcomes with the students, and then trying to do a map, in some sense, let them think in a little meta cognitive way that what is happening. So that definitely helps. In addition to sharing, of course, previous question papers and how you assess.
Yeah, so I think a lot of, any thoughtful teacher will do something like this intuitively. But where it helped me is, especially let's say if students were not doing well somewhere, often it was because I had made some mismatch between the expectations and the question paper and the instruction strategy. So this three-way alignment is, from time to time, it's useful to check. And that's the sort of tool that this provides. By the way, this goes by the name of backward design. Okay, just wanted to mention that. The reason is we first, of course, set out or we have clarity on what the outcomes are. And then instead of going here to instructional strategies, what's recommended is think of assessment. I don't mean to say that write your midsum and end question paper, like they do in the universities. Not that. But how will we know that students are actually able to achieve these? The moment we have clarity on that issue, then this instructional strategy becomes easier. So it's actually this bottom connection which makes the course engaging, interesting. And once we align this left part and the bottom, then the one on the right also sort of follows through. Rather than going only for the right one, we don't think of this question right in the beginning, that how will I know if my students have learned it? So that's another thing that this schematic helps.